Okay, everyone. I'll introduce myself. I'm Eric Wycheck, County Conservationist for the Polk County Land and Water Resources Department. And on behalf of the Horse Creek Area Watershed Council, I'd like to welcome you today to the ins and outs of carbon sequestration and carbon credits program. We're really fortunate to have Ryan Stockwell with us today from Indigo Ag. And Ryan is the Ag Partnerships Senior Manager at Indigo Ag, and he farms in Medford, Wisconsin. And I know Ryan does some no-till and cover crops, and now he's pretty heavily involved in carbon sequestration and carbon markets. So our Horse Creek Watershed Council has, in the past year, had a lot of questions in this space, and we've done a fair amount of research, and this is an emerging interest for us. And in that exploration, a lot of questions have come up, and we're really fortunate to have Ryan with us today to cover some of those basics and a little more information about carbon markets. So with that, before we get started, I'd like to just ask that everyone make sure they're muted throughout the presentation. And I think everybody is pretty savvy with Zoom by now. But if you're not, you can find the mute button in the lower left-hand corner and click that, and you should go to mute. We'll take questions towards the end. I'd encourage you all to use the chat box for your questions, and myself and Bill Hogseth, our watershed coordinator, will help go through those towards the end of the presentation. So with that, many thanks, Ryan, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, awesome. Well, appreciate the chance to speak with everybody, and thanks to Eric and Bill for putting this all together. And my goal today is just to be helpful, just to help everybody understand what the carbon markets look like, what the opportunity is for individuals, as well as for your farmer-led group in terms of doing more outreach. So I'm just going to break it down. We're just going to go through, let me forward here. So I'm just going to go through three main topics here, and like Eric mentioned, at the end we'll go through some questions. And yeah, like he said, just put those in the chat box, and we'll try to get through those as well. Yeah, so like I said, the three main goals here: just understanding some of the basic concepts. What exactly is a carbon cycle? How does this really work? And then some of the details of what actually goes into a carbon credit program. You know, we're dealing with not bushels, tangible bushels of beans or corn. This is something that's a little more abstract, so it requires a little different structure to that market. And then finally, trying to drill down and what that actually means, either for your farm or for neighbors, and engaging them in adopting some of these regenerative practices. Want to leave you with some questions that you should be asking of any carbon market opportunity. All right, so for those of you who haven't studied the science of it, I'm not a scientist, so this is about my depth of knowledge and level of the carbon cycle, but this makes sense after I've looked at it enough. So let's just walk through this here real quickly. The way I think about it is just like a water cycle or a nitrogen cycle. It's always kind of moving. Some is going up into the atmosphere, some is coming back down, some is in the soil. That's sometimes coming up, going back down. The three main forces at work here, though, so photosynthesis, so the process of plants taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, creating oxygen, and then they put that carbon down either into the plant matter or further down into the soil. Then you have decomposition, so basically the reversal of that occurring, and oxidation, which is jumping from soil all the way to the atmosphere, and not going through plants. So it's that upswing that's going back. we've had a couple of things that have really thrown that out of whack. For the most part, this carbon cycle has stayed pretty stable until the last 150 years or so. The big straw going down into fossil fuels, well, that's a big one. That's really changed the balance of where that carbon is located. But then you actually take a look at what we want to talk about, and what's oftentimes missed is understanding the interaction between the soil and the atmosphere. And so when we start shortening up the photosynthetic process, the amount of time that plants are growing on the landscape, removing plants and exposing that soil to oxidation, then we're shifting the balance of that carbon cycle. All right, so what does this actually mean for us then? So like I said, some activities can help this cycle move that material, move that carbon down into the soil where it needs to be. And some activities will actually take it out of the soil and push it more towards the atmosphere where we don't need it. So like I mentioned, when you talk about photosynthesis, you can increase the downward arrow by having more plants growing for a longer period of time. So that's where we're looking at cover cropping, intercropping, longer crop rotations. And on the flip side with photosynthesis, the more fallow period that you have where there isn't anything green and growing, the more that you're basically going to allow that carbon dioxide to go back up into the atmosphere. Another management practice that can influence those arrows is how we manage surface residue. So again, anytime that we can increase and retain the residue on that soil surface, so no-till and rotational grazing in particular, they keep that residue there and on the surface. That's going to help increase the downward arrow and make that stronger. And that's what we're looking for. And on the flip side, when we remove residue, then we're basically, again, allowing for more oxidation, and we're not allowing that residue to decompose and further become locked into the soil. And then there's that last main strategy or practice that we can have to influence the carbon cycle. So soil exposure. So soil has a lot of carbon in it. So you've got the C molecule. When that gets exposed to the air, which has a lot of oxygen molecules, that C will release from the soil and attach to the oxygen in the atmosphere and create carbon dioxide. Now we've just reached the limit of my science capabilities here. But you get the point, is that every time that we expose more soil to the surface, especially soil that's been locked down below for some time, that has been able to accumulate a little bit of carbon, the more that it's going to release once it's oxidized. All right, so we have some control and some influence on what happens. On the flip side, there are some things that we just can't control. The climate or weather, and certainly soil type, location. These two factors give the range of possibility for how much carbon or how quickly we can put carbon back into the soil. So when you look at this map, that mid-Mississippi River Valley, basically that beautiful farmland of Iowa, Illinois, even through Missouri, that stuff that's highly productive, it has the potential to also sequester a lot of carbon. Now in northwestern or north central Wisconsin, we're not terribly far off, but it's obviously not the same capability. And that's predominantly because of the weather or climate and soil type. And obviously when you get out west, they have a far less capacity to really add a lot of carbon quickly. And that's, again, a nature of the weather. They might have the right temperatures, but they also are limited in moisture. Moisture is a key feature to getting that decomposition and breaking down plant matter into the soil so that those carbon molecules get down low. All right, so that's our science lesson for the day. We're going to dig into carbon markets. And on that, I want to start real simply. We're going to just get some terms down so that we can start digging into the details. So atmospheric carbon dioxide, think of it this way. So it's one big market. 1 ton of carbon dioxide over Chicago is the same essentially as 1 ton of carbon dioxide in Amory. Wherever that stuff is coming from, it all goes into one big bank account, and that's the atmosphere. You know, when we oftentimes talk about water quality, it's much more location specific. Getting water quality solved in Horse Creek, that's great, but the buyers for any sort of credits are limited to those that are interested or situated in Horse Creek. So there's some advantages and disadvantages when we look at a carbon market versus, say, some ideas that are developing about an ecosystem services market that it would include water quality trading. That's going to be a lot more difficult to build up just because you're talking about a much limited market. So in essence, what we're talking about here with a carbon market is the basic premise that if we can get a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in one area, that will be, again, here's an assumption here, as long as everything else is equal, that should be a net gain. Basically, we've reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, let me go back here. So let me explain these key terms real quickly. So carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is, we need to get everything in the same language or the same currency. Think of carbon dioxide equivalent. So there are 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. They have different powers, and so they try to put it into one single currency, so to speak. And then when it comes to the measurement, the ton, that's a metric ton. So think of it as, we're going to talk about bushels is another easy way to do it. Let's, you know, we adjust bushels for moisture content. And then that's the same idea here with carbon. All right. So I want to, in digging further into explaining a carbon market, I want to start on the demand side, and we're going to work our way back until we get to the supply side, which is everybody here. Ideally, we all eventually become suppliers at some point if we're farmers. On the demand side, though, what we're seeing is that companies are feeling the pressure to take a stand, to take some sort of activity to address major climate risks or major environmental issues. This is just a quick recap. I'm sure there are a bunch more out there of companies that are working, setting goals for themselves. And keep in mind, when they're setting goals, that means 2 things. One is they are going to implement strategies within their company to start bringing down their own emissions. And then whatever they can't bring down, they will buy carbon credits to accomplish. And if you look at this list, you'll see that this really runs a wide range of sectors. We got everything from transportation to tech, finance, there's insurance on there, consumer goods, durables, autos, there's cars on there. So it really runs a gamut. Just to give a little more detail into, again, why they're making this decision, why they're entering the carbon market as demand participants, for 2 reasons: investors and consumers. Both investors and consumers are wanting to take action, and they see these 2 strategies or their roles with companies as a way to make that happen. We're seeing a lot more investors pushing their companies to do this, and they're doing that for purely financial reasons. For either they see climate as a significant risk to the survival of that company, just in terms of supply chain disruption, significantly higher costs and risks under an unstable climate, or they're seeing it in terms of needing to meet the demand of the other side of this chart or the other side of this this slide, which are the consumers. What we're seeing here, and there's just some basic numbers there, and that gives some credence to the extent that consumers are willing to take action. They're willing to pay more for products that are taking action on climate. More recent studies are showing that not only are they willing to pay more, here's the big one, is that they're willing to not even consider companies or brands that are not taking action. They're just straight on off the table. Like, we're just not going to buy from you if you are not taking enough action. That's what's driving these companies. That's what's driving them to become demand participants in a climate or a carbon market. All right, we got to go through some nuts and bolts here to really start piecing this all together. So we've got a number of key factors that we need to think about when it comes to making sure that this is functioning. You can have demand and you can have supply, but without these pieces in between, you're going to have unmet demand and unmet supply. It's just not going to function and flow very well. So how they relate and how we accomplish these particular characteristics is going to be really important. And this is where we start shifting slowly over to understanding and thinking about what does this mean for growers and for the supply side of a carbon credit market. So for one, we need to have clear ownership of that credit. That may sound simple, but when we start thinking about all these other avenues that growers can get compensation for taking particular actions, if it's a local cost share, maybe it's a federal cost share, maybe there's a state program, maybe they have a program through the commodity buyer, maybe there's a program through the local elevator. There's a number of different ways that growers could potentially get compensated for implementing a particular practice. Now, it's possible that maybe each and every one of those wants to lay claim to the carbon reduction that occurs with, let's say, cover crops. That could create a problem. Now we have a lot of uncertainty and people don't know what they're buying from the demand side. All right, the second component or characteristic that we have to think about is what is essentially additionality. And we'll explain this just a little bit more here shortly, but it's having that clear connection between the presence of the market and that decision to implement that practice. And I'll explain here shortly why that's so significant. So thirdly, and again, this third component or characteristic, verification that the action led to an actual change in carbon sequestration, again, goes back to this very basic reality that carbon credits are intangible, right? They are an abstract idea and they live on paper. They don't live in a bin. They don't live out on the field. We can't observe them with our own eyes and we can't track them very easily. So when that's the basis of the product being exchanged, verification becomes really important. So then finally, the last component is having some sort of certainty that the carbon sequestered is one, accomplished. So this comes down to measurement. How do we know that and can have confidence that we know that that happened and that it's maintained for a period of time? So we're gonna just dig into those a little bit. All right, like I said, this additionality component. So this is a new action that increases that the rate of carbon sequestration on a farm, right? And here's the key definition though, the key factor of that definition is that new practice would not have likely have occurred without the presence of that carbon market. This goes back to, and essentially what's going on here is that if you go back to our conversation about the demand side and they're feeling that pressure by the consumers to take action, what has happened in the past is a number of companies have felt that pressure, and so they did something to lay claim that they're taking action. They're trying to satisfy their consumers or their customers, but it is inauthentic and it's incomplete. And so what that means is that those buyers fell into the greenwash category, and that is something that they do not want to fall into, because that is a really bad public relations position to be in. So they are entering the carbon market wanting to have absolute validity and verification of those carbon credits, that carbon being sequestered. That way they can point others who accuse them of greenwash to follow the documentation and take a look at that. Let me give you an example. Some of you are old enough to remember the Chicago Climate Exchange about 10 or 12 years ago. First effort at an operating carbon market, and for a while it worked. It worked on the premise that there would be increasing demand through a cap and trade legislation that would require all major industries to start buying carbon credits and start reducing their emissions. Under that assumption, then the quality of the carbon credits doesn't matter so much. In that situation, just sign up growers, just get them signed up so that they're generating carbon credits. Well, that cap and trade program never took off. It didn't pass legislation. And so what was left was a voluntary market. They were buying carbon credits that had been signed up. Growers were receiving payment for adopting no-till up to 10 years prior to the establishment of this market. So when it's a voluntary market, the buyers are sort of scratching their heads wondering, what did I just buy? What am I proving out to show that this is something that's actually helping the environment? If it's already occurring, what added benefit am I providing to addressing climate change? And what we found is that they really couldn't answer that question, and it didn't hold up very well. That carbon market went from $7.40 at its peak to right before it closed to 4 cents per ton. Obviously 4 cents per ton just doesn't pencil out for doing any sort of work. It's not functioning, and it died. So the point is that it needs to be additional. It needs to be something new that is tied to the grower signing up. So that means, and I want everybody to ask me questions on this later, but what that by definition means is that a grower should theoretically sign up first for a carbon program, then start implementing the practices, and then they'll start getting paid. There's a little bit of wiggle room in that, but we can go into that a little bit later. All right, the next characteristic here we need to take a look at is measurement. So like I said, it's a very abstract idea. So how do we actually measure that so that the seller, the producer, receives a fair price and a fair compensation for what they produce? And at the same time, the buyer has confidence that what they're paying for, they're actually getting. All right, I'm going to lay this out there. There we go. 4 main ways that we can accomplish measurement. So the first one is to sample every acre that's involved in a program. When you take a soil sample for bulk density, for carbon, for soil type, then you can track right down to the 0.1% every acre every year in terms of how much carbon is being sequestered into the soil. Some of you are probably already recognizing that that's just is really expensive to run that level of soil sampling on every acre every year. That would eat up the entire cost of the carbon credit. And so essentially nothing would flow to the farmer. There would be no gain. All right, so that isn't going to be workable for a market. Second option is to set default values. Let's not soil sample. Let's just assume that, hey, if you're going from conventional fall chisel and Springfield cultivate to no-till, you're going to generate this much in terms of carbon sequestration. Now, it's really simple, low cost, but the accuracy is terrible. So when Volkswagen and some of these others are wanting to buy carbon credits, and they say, well, how many carbon credits are we talking? Well, it's a range of 0.05 to 0.85. Well, what does that mean? So that level of uncertainty also doesn't work. So the third avenue is to develop a model that takes into account the baseline practices, the new practice, the climate, the soils, a number of things, and it takes thousands of data points and says, okay, we're going to basically get a much more refined number in compared to that default value. So now we're talking maybe like 0.45 to 0.6 tons to the acre. Okay, that's better, but again, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And what if our models are off to begin with? So there's no rechecking over time. So that's where the fourth method comes into play. And that's using a model with a little bit of random sampling. That allows us to, and again, so just as a quick sales pitch, Indigo is the only one that has that system where we use the model, but then we randomly sample 5% of carbon acres every year to make sure that the model is accurate, to feed into that so that it's continuously learning and improving. So that means that we can get a very narrow range and narrow it and also have more confidence that it's getting more precise every year. All right, permanence is basically just some semblance of assurance that the carbon that gets sequestered this year will stay there for a while. Because a simple reality is that we could sequester carbon for 10 years in all of St. Croix County, and 10 years from now, a bunch of new growers decide that they're going to till it all up and it all goes back into the atmosphere. What did the buyers just buy? And they're going to wonder that same thing. So what that requires in a lot of programs is some level of assurance. Either a grower commits and says, yes, absolutely, in fact, they will do that. Or there's a risk that they will have to pay back some payment of the carbon credits in case that happens. Or the other option is to spread out those payments over a period of years so that growers maintain that incentive to maintain the practice. So Indigo does a 5-year vesting, and vesting or payment schedule is quite common. And that is important to provide that assurance of permanence for at least the period that is promised in that carbon credit system. So as you can see here, the way that the vesting schedule works for Indigo is 50% is paid out after completion of the first year of that carbon credit. So that, and then over the next 4 years, that gets paid out according to the chart on the left. How this fits together then is that, so that was year one. In year two, you create another set of credits. Well, those are paid out over the next 5 years, and so on and so forth until they stack up and equal essentially 100% of what you're producing. All right, so verification. So we had the measurement component and we have the permanence component, but the verification basically says, okay, so you have one entity that says this is how they're measuring, this is how they're ensuring permanence, but are they even close to accurate in any of that? And so the easiest way to accomplish that is to get third parties, other organizations, to take a look at both the data and the methods that that organization is using and attest to others that, in fact, yes, this is the proper way to do it. This is a good way to do it. And it's truthful and productive. Think of it as, you know, one of DATCAP's roles is measurements. That, and I always think of this every time I go and fill up at the gas station. You see that little sticker that says, yes, DATCAP has verified and measured this pump to say that this is accurate and that you can trust what the dial says. That's an important symbol to have, and that's the similar importance when it comes to verification in the carbon market. Here's a real quick note. You'll hear a lot of these terms from various carbon market opportunities out there. So we should really break these down. They do not quite mean the same thing. They are not quite the same. So it's important to just distinguish these a little bit here. So some of you have probably heard a few mention audits as a way to provide that verification. So an audit is just simply double checking some numbers and double checking that some practices were accomplished that carbon market says growers did. Oftentimes an audit does not look at every grower. And oftentimes that does not include taking a look at the method, how the entity quantified that carbon credit. So verification will go down to every farmer and to verify that, yes, in fact, every carbon credit being generated was based on those practices being implemented. And then finally, using a registry is the third-party seal of approval. It's that DATCAP stamp on that gas pump that says, yes, the methods being used here make total sense. All right, so some of you have heard some of some of these registries. So they are either nonprofit or third-party organization that is designed to not necessarily to buy and sell credits, but to give confidence and trust to the carbon credit world. Anytime that you have any of these, this is the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. This is the Better Business Bureau stamp of approval. This is that cap symbol on the gas pump that says, yes, in fact, the methodology, the way that they measure this stuff, the way that they quantify it, the data being collected is all accurate, and you can feel confident buying that carbon credit generated from that entity. So just kind of a quick note here, if you're looking at carbon market opportunities, to me, this is a good signal that if they're using any of these on this list, that the carbon credit you're generating is going to have higher demand because the buyer can feel more confident with that, and that they can then be willing to pay a higher price. If you go back to that Chicago Climate Exchange example, when a buyer doesn't know what they're getting, that price and that demand is going to come down. Having this seal, any of them on there, is going to be helpful for you as producers so that you can get the best price. All right, so I've got just a few other slides here, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. We want to make sure that everybody feels really comfortable in whoever they're working with. So these are 6 questions that everybody should be asking anytime they get approached by a carbon credit opportunity. Start asking these questions. So how am I paid? So there are some entities that don't pay in cash. They pay in discounts for products, or they pay through cryptocurrency, which, yeah, I suppose Bitcoin would be pretty exciting right now. But I'm not sure if I want to base everything on that. Then a second question is ask about what fees. Some entities require that the grower pay for soil sampling, pay for verification, pay for some other factors. It's kind of like that fine print that they often bury. So you're going to want to ask about that. So again, sales pitch, Indigo doesn't charge any fees. Our platform, the money goes one way, and that's to the grower. Third question that you're going to want to ask is, what do you get paid for? So if you remember early on, I mentioned those carbon dioxide equivalents, the 3 main gases that can build up in the atmosphere and cause climate change. So carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Growers in row crops can really influence 2 of those. So carbon dioxide through how you manage that soil, but then also nitrous oxide, how you manage your nitrogen fertilizer. Some carbon credits will only credit for carbon dioxide. And you may be missing an opportunity with nitrogen management, especially if you're adding a legume cover crop where you're able to bring down your total N application. That could be a significant portion. So question number 4 that you want to ask, who certifies? So again, back to that question of audit versus verification versus registry approved. That's going to tell you and will give you good signal as to what is the long-term demand for that carbon credit through that company or through that organization. And that sort of relates to question number 5. The more that entity works to be accurate in its measurement, as well as provide confidence to the buyer, the more that they're going to have long-term demand for their carbon credits. So take a look at how they do that. And then finally, question number 6, are they just leaving you to do it on your own, or are they going to work with you and give you a help to figure it out? That's a very valid question to ask. All right, like I mentioned before, there's a process in here. So this is sort of the general process that one can expect in just about any carbon credit program. So step 1 is to sign up. So you've got to get your name on the list and say that, hey, I'm interested in producing carbon credits. Step 2 is you make those changes. So adding cover crops, going to no-till, diversifying your crop rotation, reducing your N application, all of those could create carbon credits. So, and again, going back to what we talked about earlier, has to be that additionality. So something new with the sign up of the program. Now, Indigo and a bunch of most other platforms allow up to a 2-year look back period, it's called. So what that means is that when you sign up, we're able to go back at most 2 years in time to find something new that you started. So let's say that you started no-till in last year in 20, and you sign up this year for Indigo Carbon, we'd be able to go back and say, okay, that was a new practice. We're going to start measuring from there and use that as the basis for generating carbon credits. It's been approved by the registries, and so it has a good, strong, defensible position. It's not the 10 years that some of us would like. I've been doing no-till and covers for 10 years, and I would love to qualify that for carbon credits. But again, I recognize that if we do that, we will go down the path of Chicago Climate Exchange, and eventually those carbon credits will be worth 0. So we have to, at the end of the day, make sure that we are producing a product that the buyers are willing to buy. And that's the importance of that additionality. All right, so step 3, if you've got into a program, you're gonna have to enter in data. So just a basic rule of thumb here is that data is going to be a part of this process. And for some growers, that can be a bit of a headache, but just keep in mind what that means. And a lot of this is upfront homework, just getting some of your baseline data in and doing a little bit of homework every year. But recognizing what this could mean for your additional income stream could be significant. It's well worth your time. So steps 4, 5, and 6. So after step 3, the grower is pretty much done with their half of the process. And then it becomes the part of Indigo or whichever carbon credit organization you work with to accomplish the rest that you see here. Oh, I want to make 2 quick announcements, and then we'll have a good amount of time here to do some Q&A. We do have some free resources available. So we have Carbon College available to anybody out there. We did get CEUs for that. So if you're an agronomist or if you have an agronomist that you'd like to get them moving in this direction, direct them here and they can earn some continuing education credits and start learning about carbon and how to farm with those principles in mind. Also, just a quick announcement. Next week, we've got another webinar. webinars monthly, and we talk with carbon credit buyers. We talk with growers involved in the program, agronomic experts, farmers who are well versed in regenerative practices. So it's a great opportunity to just learn more from all of them, so that your practices can be, it's easier to improve that and work and refine over time. And you can feel a little more comfortable in hearing other people's experiences in the carbon credit program. So, so feel free to sign up. This one is through No Till Farmer. So just go to the No Till Farmer website and you can sign up for that webinar at that point. So we've got some time for Q&A. So I guess, Eric, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Mhm.
We've got a few questions in the chat here. I'll start out here with the first one. Mitchell McCarthy asks, what carbon sequestration models are out there and where do we find them?
Yeah, there are a number of models out there. There's the Comet Farm model. There's also, Dagon has their biogeochemical model, and I believe there's a couple of others, but the Comet Farm and the Dagon are the two main models out there. I know that the Comet Farm is accessible, that you can punch in numbers for your farm and operation and you can start getting some estimates. I've tried using that thing and it is really clunky. If you're curious, I know there might be some organizations out there that can help. And we're in the process of developing a carbon credit calculator as well. So we're hoping to release that here sometime in the second half of this year.
Very good. Thanks, Ryan. Maybe Bill, in the background, we could throw the web address for Comet Planner or Comet Farm in the chat box. Let's move on here. Michael Slattery asked, or it's kind of more of a comment, I guess, but we can touch on it. When he looked into engaging into carbon sequestration markets 12 to 13 years ago, it just did not pay enough to cover his time and applicable acres. Do you have any response to that, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think a couple of things have changed since then, Michael, and great to hear from you again, by the way. The data capacity, the data required to produce a higher value carbon credit, we're getting more of that data available, right? And just think about how much more data is available about our farm. When we didn't have that data 10 or 12 years ago, we had to do a lot of stuff manually. So the capacity wasn't there, which meant that the buyer couldn't feel that as comfortable about buying that carbon credit. So the price can go higher because of that capacity with data. And also the convenience of some of the data platforms out there means that if you're managing a lot of this data, it's a lot easier to just shift that over. So the homework side of this should get a lot easier. If you're using Climate Field View, Granular, My John Deere, any of these platforms that are capturing a lot of your data, the design is that they can just speak and transfer a lot of data right into whichever platform that you're working. So I think in the end, the price will be higher because of that data, and the homework component will be easier. So hopefully it'll get to a point where it's more worth your time.
Next question is from Mitchell again, and this is maybe for everybody, but he asked about this presentation being recorded, and it is, and where will it be posted following this session? We'll share the link with everyone that registered today, and I assume also we'll try and get that up on the Horse Creek Area Watershed Council Facebook page too. That's another place where we'd like to get it and disseminate it to interested people. Another question here, Ted Callan. What's the minimum acreage that allows one to be technically eligible? Or are there fixed fees that would just make it unprofitable to take part under a certain acreage?
Yeah, and that's a question that you'll have to ask, if there's any program that approaches you, you'll have to ask that question. For Indigo Carbon, the way that we structure it, you need to have control of 150 acres. That's the minimum. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to enroll all 150. Our hope is that you start with one field out of that 150 and you see the value of implementing these practices and you'll want to enroll more. But that's our structure. I know some of them out there have like 1,000 acre or 2,000 acre minimums.
Okay, next question from Scott Stipetich. Do you have an estimate of the number of farms in Wisconsin that have successfully signed up for Indigo Carbon that are currently receiving payments? Any that
Yeah.
are willing to share their story as well?
Right. Yeah. So here's, so we are currently, Indigo is currently not in Wisconsin. We're working on a state expansion plan right now, and our goal is to be able to get into Wisconsin and Michigan by July. We are in Minnesota, so if you're across the border, you're in. And part of that was due to all sorts of technical limitations that take time to overcome, and so they're getting to them now. But again, our goal is to be in Wisconsin in July.
Okay, the next question from Steve Richter. I think this kind of touches on additionality and kind of the fall of the Chicago Climate Exchange, but I'll read it here. Why couldn't you still enroll your land even though you've used no-till and covers for 10 years if carbon is building in the soil year after year? He's a bit confused as to why it has to be a field that has never seen the practice. A farm can stop no-till / covers for a couple years and then re-enroll, which ruins all of the buildup of carbon. Can you speak to that a little bit, Ryan?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues there, Steve, and great to hear from you again. So on the one hand there's actually three issues here. So on the one hand is the additionality component. So this goes back to what buyers are willing to buy. I think there's a lot of buyers that would honestly like to say that, yeah, we're supporting a grower to continue their carbon sequestration. But that's a big challenge, and there's a big potential of getting tagged as greenwashing. And so they're very careful about that. And we saw what happened with Chicago Climate Exchange. The second component to think about here is that when it comes to these practices, they're not either or. And what I mean by that is there is opportunity, at least within the Indigo Carbon program, for growers to qualify for generating carbon credits by intensifying a little bit. So like with cover crops, let's say that you're planting a crop after harvest, single species, and you're terminating it a week before planting the following crop. If you decide to go to interseeding with multiple species and terminate a week after planting your next cash crop, you're increasing that photosynthetic period, right? That additional sequestration can qualify for carbon credits. So we're trying to find all these ways that, yes, in fact, you're doing more and you're producing more carbon and getting it into the ground. And then that third part of gaming the system, I think that's a valid concern. Like you're telling me that, so on my farm, been no-tilling and using covers for 10 years, I don't qualify. But if I went and tilled it up for a period of time, I could qualify. Yeah, that's something that we obviously don't want to happen. The way that we sort of manage for that is that, again, this goes back to the data entry that I mentioned earlier. Growers need to enter in a certain amount of historic data, depending on your crop rotation. So if you have a 2-crop rotation, you need to enter in 4 years of historic data. What happens there is if at any time in that historic data, it showed that you were doing some of these practices, that messes with the baseline. So in order to game the system, if you're in a 2-crop rotation, you need to do the tillage for 4 years, and then you could sign up again, or now you'd get your opportunity to sign up. That being said, I want to keep this in perspective here. What we're talking about is not a significant amount of money. Like this, it's helpful. We're talking about, in our area, if you go from conventional tillage with chisel plow in the fall and some field cultivate and field finish in the spring, to no-till and maybe a single species cover in front of one of your cash crops, you're looking at 3/4 of a ton of carbon dioxide per acre per year. Okay, so what that really comes down to is about 13, 14 bucks an acre every year. Now, I mean, if you are really jonesing to get that extra 14 bucks an acre by busting out the plow and going back to burning 20 bucks per acre of fuel, I guess then that's your choice. But you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot to go after that little additional. Our point here is that this is icing on the cake. The key thing that is really important here is the profitability that can be gained by implementing these practices, regardless of the carbon credit. By going to no-till and covers, you're already reducing costs and improving productivity, that it should be of value right then and there. But this carbon market allows us to find just a little bit of additional money to get to growers so that they can do this, and it can be helpful.
Okay, we have got a lot of questions, and I think it might be good to, if Ryan is okay with this, put your contact information, email in the chat box. If we could work at doing that, Bill, that'd be really great. And then we'll just take a few more. I want to be considerate of your time, Ryan. And I've got one additional question. Well, there's quite a few more questions here, but one that kind of shirt tails off the last one, so we'll go to that one. Brad Johnson asks, where does a farm that already has a long-term history of planting no-till and using cover crop fit into a program like this? Is there a fit?
Yeah, so join the club to some extent. Like I said, I've been doing this for a number of years. The opportunity is in a few different ways here. So predominantly with cover crops, getting more intense in your cover crops, planting them sooner, terminating them later. One cover crop strategy that I'm going to be testing out in the next few years is to frost seed cereal rye ahead of soybeans, and to see what happens when they do not vernalize. There may be potential that they actually grow well into June and will get pretty tall, but they will die out on their own accord. I'll be terminating a month or 6 weeks into that soybean crop. That's a lot of growth right there, especially the models recognize having that growth in May and June. We've all seen what cereal rye does at that time period. And so that's going to be huge for generating carbon credit. So if you're able to go to something like that, that helps. We're also, same thing when it comes to nitrogen fertilizer, if you any ways to, again, reduce the synthetic fertilizer, switching over to other sources. So manure and cover crops. And then the third thing that I would mention, and we're in process of creating the methodology or the way that we account for this, is livestock grazing. So we are working on adding livestock grazing to generate carbon credits. So that's in process, and certainly anybody with cover crops knows that there's some good potential there.
Here's another one. These are really great questions. Everybody, appreciate you taking the time and thought into some of these. Becky Brothel asks, do you see taking land out of production as being eligible, such as planting pollinator habitat?
Yeah, so right now, our methodology doesn't have a way of quantifying that. One of the key features that the carbon market looks at is it's called leakage. And that is when you implement a practice that generates a carbon credit, but it reduces the yield that would that is required to feed the world or feed the planet, all of that. The way that market forces work, leakage recognizes that somebody else is going to be incentivized to produce that bushel of corn somewhere else. And that's going to mean probably somewhere else being taken out. So the idea of putting like CRP or these pollinator strips into a carbon market, it has an extra layer of difficulty to it to produce that credit.
I think we maybe have time for one more question, Ryan, and I know you've got a hard stop at 4, so apologize everybody. We've only got Ryan for a little bit longer. Daryl Smith asks, can you give some numbers for the range of dollars per acre being paid to farmers in the upper Midwest or Wisconsin?
Yeah. So again, the range can vary dramatically, right? If your baseline is conventional till and you're going to no till, adding a third crop, adding cover crops ahead of 2 or 3 crops, reducing your nitrogen, well, you could be, and again, depending on your soil and location, you could be getting up to 2 tons, over 2 tons to the acre per year. Or if you just reduce your tillage, you go from a fall chisel to just a vertical till, well, you could be adding 0.25 or a quarter of a ton per acre per year. So it's a pretty wide range, but those are sort of the numbers that we're seeing.
Very good. I've got 3:59. Ryan, how you doing on time?
30 seconds or so?
Yeah, probably. Okay, last question. Can we pool farms in our producer groups so we can act as one cooperative seller?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of groups mention this. I think right now, the way that the data structure requires and the clear line of ownership, we need to work with the farm operator individually. That being said, what I see happening over the next couple of years would be the potential for doing more location-specific carbon crediting, that entities out of Minneapolis would like to buy credits within a region. And so we'd like to be able to trace that back and be able to distinguish within the carbon credit market and say, okay, everybody within 100 miles of Minneapolis, they're willing to pay a little bit more. So that's something that we're working on.
Okay, very good. I want to thank Ryan for joining us today and sharing this. You answered a lot of questions I had, and I think we touched on quite a few of the audience's questions too. Ryan's contact information is in the chat. Hopefully he can help. If we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. But I want to thank everybody that attended today, and I'm hopeful that this helped answer some of your questions and maybe is a start of conversations in your area. If you're not locally within the Horse Creek watershed here, about carbon sequestration and carbon farming. So any parting words,
Yeah,
Ryan?
thanks all. No, I appreciate the time, and yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I got to jump, but yeah, thanks again for the time.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And I'm not so sure. Hopefully the next meeting can be in person, and we'll take that one step at a time. But thanks for joining us on this virtual event. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Question for you, Bill.
Yeah, Eric.
Can we capture some of these questions in the chat somehow?
Yep, I can save it right now. Yeah, I just saved it.
Good.
Lots of engagement, lots of good questions.
Yeah, it's